everyone, my name is Jabir Deralla.
Hello everyone, my name is Roger Casale.
Roger, it's great to be back for episode 2 of Eyes on Democracy. Today, as agreed, we are turning our spotlight on democracy, on your visions of the future of European Union and of Europe for citizens. Our spotlight will be also very much on values and the future of Europe and the European Union as such after the victory of Ukraine to gain its freedom and its long path to recovery. Few days ago, I want to discover this to our audience. A few days ago, we had a very nice meeting with the team of Civil here in Skopje, and you had a real wonderful, short but wonderful speech about what Europe is in your vision, and you started with a history of Europe as or European Union that has been founded on its need for peace, for stability, for democracy, and then it transformed into a superpower, a global superpower of development of money, Europe of money. So the number one Europe or Europe one was, and I probably now don't remember all the details, but now you will explain more. But Europe one, Europe of foundation, democracy and peace, and then Europe two was the Europe of money, if I may call it that way. And then you spoke of Europe three, Europe which is people-centered, Europe of its citizens and for its citizens, and it really made a real impact on me, on our team. We discussed amongst each other on the team after the meeting was over, and it still stays with us. It's really valuable, in my view, to speak about this in this episode 2 of the Eyes on Democracy. And maybe you explain a bit more of your vision. But before that, tell us about Europe 1 and Europe 2 briefly.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jabir. And yes, you've paraphrased my theory very well, but I'm indeed delighted to spell it out in a little bit more detail for our dear viewers. But just before I do that, you talked about the future of Europe. Yes, I'm going to say a little bit about history, but I think we need to start not with history, but thinking about the future of Europe. And the future of Europe, Europe doesn't have a future unless it can become a safe space for democracy and human rights, in my view. And we take Europe, the European Union, but also the broader Europe, perhaps the Europe of the Council of Europe, the Europe of, you talked about values, of a shared set of values, aspirations to those values. Not everywhere are those values very much in evidence, but people sign up, governments sign up to those values, that we identify ourselves as European. And, sometimes people say, well, isn't that a little bit exclusive? Isn't that saying that Europe's got better values than everybody else? And my answer to that is no. I think what the European Union is about is embracing what I think of as universal values, which are the values of democracy and human rights and the rule of law and others, equality, solidarity, the values of the French Revolution, equality, solidarity, and liberty.
And in the end of the day, also the Declaration
making those values and rights, and building institutions that have those universal values at the core. So it's not about projecting kind of European values. It's about saying, let's build a society, let's build our institutions, anchoring those values in those institutions. And that's what's inspiring for me about the European Union. A lot of people say, well, the European Union, you talk about values, human rights and equality and so on. There's a lot of inequality. Yes, we live in an imperfect world. I'm talking about the vision. I'm talking about the dream. I'm talking about the intention. I'm talking about what it is that we're trying to do, what it is that we're trying to build here. We're trying to build a society with those values really running through the institutions, every aspect of them. And who is we? Who is we? Because we talk about the European Union, but actually, I think of it as more than one union. I think of it as three unions, a triple unity, a triple union, a trinity, if you like, not a holy trinity, a singular trinity, but a trinity all the same. And so that's why that's why I talk about three unions. That's why I talk about Europe 1, Europe 2, and Europe 3. So what is Europe 1? Well, you said it. Europe 1 is the Europe of nations and states. And Europe 1 is what was built after the Second World War, after the experience of the Second World War, which was an absolutely nihilistic, destructive experience, the Holocaust, millions of Jews who were exterminated in the camps. It was absolutely darkest possible hour, and left the whole of continental Europe in ruins, absolutely destroyed. And out of that nothingness, out of that destruction, out of that void, and that pain and that trauma, came a project called the European Gold and Steel Community, and later the Common Agricultural Policy. And a lot of people think that this is all about economics, but in fact it's about politics, much more about politics than it was about economics, also about economics. It was about merging the coal and steel industries of Germany and France and the armaments industries so that you could no longer have war in Europe. Okay. And the quid pro quo for that was protecting French agriculture. So there was a political deal and to secure peace in Europe. And there had to be a compromise, something that hadn't happened before. Each side had to give something up. And it was done in a statesmanlike way. It was done by politicians, by leaders, by people like Schuman, Monnet. We know the names: Adenauer, de Gasperi, Henry Spaak from Belgium, and others. And this is what I talk about as Europe 1. It's the Europe of nations and states. Initially, 6 nations and states came together to form was essentially a political union.
And that was a very important point that you're making there. Sorry to interrupt you, but it's a very important point that you made there. A compromise in which each side had to give up something. It's not to grab. Compromising means that each side gives a little bit away, gives a little bit of this or that, and so on. But then that means that gives away in order to come to the equal or nearly equal basis to reach an agreement that can be sustainable, that can keep the peace and stability between nations. It's very important. Me coming from the Balkans, where compromises are only on paper and in the speeches, but then not even in speeches, where compromises mean betrayal of national interests or whatever. So that was a very important point for me to make for the audiences in regions in Europe where compromise is understood or presented as betrayal, whilst it is not, far from that.
Yes, that's absolutely right.
A betrayal.
That's absolutely right, to emphasize that it was a compromise, and thank you for doing that. And you're pointing to areas today where perhaps compromises are needed. But compromise is not an end in itself. Compromise is a means to an end. And you see the reason that these countries compromised, instead of, how many times have France and Germany been to war since the Franco-German-Prussian War in 1870? Many, many times, many times. And how much blood had been spilt into the River Rhine in places like Strasbourg on the Rhine.
Yes.
As areas of Europe like Alsace-Lorraine changed hands, depending on whether it was the Germans and the Prussians who won, or the French, or the First World, Second World War, and so on. And so they had to, and they did make a compromise in the end. But the reason the compromise was a means to an end. What was the end? What was the purpose of their compromise? Was it to serve their economies? Well, it did serve their economies. It served them rather well, as it turned out. But that wasn't what was driving the compromise. What was driving the compromise was something greater than their individual interests, was something that was fundamental to having a future at all. And it was driven by the idea that if we do this, we will have peace in Europe. So there was a greater vision. Well, it was done because they wanted peace. In my view, it was done because they wanted peace. Because without peace, what do you have? They knew the answer to that question because it was a few years after the Second World War. And what you had was a desertification of Europe. What you had was a wasteland. And out of that darkness and death, out of things, the poet John Donne would say, darkness and death, things that are not. Out of things that are not emerged the European Union because of peace. Yeah, because they wanted peace. Because if you don't have peace, what you have are things that are not. You have darkness, you have nothingness. So nothing can happen. Nothing can happen. It doesn't take away conflict. It doesn't take away conflict of interest. It doesn't take away the other things that you have to fix, prosperity that you've mentioned, but it's absolutely fundamental. And because they were so fresh from the trauma of the war, they understood how important peace was in those days. And we need to understand how important peace is today. That hasn't changed. But we are 80 years away from the Second World War, and they were 10, 12 years away from the Second World War. So the memory, we don't have first-hand experience of the Second World War. They did. So we don't know in the same way, we don't have that experience of understanding how peace is. But we must try, in my view, to understand how important peace is. So Europe One was built to create peace. It was a political compromise in the name of peace, and it created the European Coal and Steel Community, and later the European Economic Community and the Treaty of Rome, and so on. And its purpose was to secure peace in Europe. And it was created by statesmen, often statesmen, by the way, who were born in border areas of Europe. I mentioned Schumann, who comes from Alsace-Lorraine, which I've talked about. De Gasperi came from Alto Adige, where they speak Italian and German on the German-French border. Spaak was from Belgium. How many times had that changed side front? So you had people who had an identity, had a regional identity, and who understood that although in their region you had people of different nationalities, there was something that they had in common, that was above that. And that's what they tried to create. That was the kind of insight that they brought, to understand that you actually can create a European identity. And people think that it's some sort of super state thing, but it's actually coming from much more from a kind of regional idea, the idea that we have multiple identities. We have regional and national, and we can have European identities. We don't have to have one identity. And the visionaries of Europe One were people who had that sense of a strong regional identity. So they could make friends with people of different nationalities. And if they could do that at the regional level, they knew they could do it at the European level. And they went ahead and did it. And it was inspiring, and it was historic, and it was done mainly by men. It was done by men because those were the times we lived in. Later, we had very important women leaders, and today we have a women leader of the European Commission, which is very good that we have a women leader of the European Commission. But in those days, that's what it was. They were statesmen, they were governments. It became the Europe One, the first union, the Europe of nations and states.
So that was done by people who actually lived their multiple identities through their practical experiences, through their lives, through their connections, and through their upbringing, if you like.
Yes.
So that was very important to give the floor, the power to the people who understand these values. That those are not values that are written somewhere and okay, let's study this and let's try to create it. They lived it. They were living examples of these developments of Europe, and that was fantastic. Let's go to Europe too, maybe.
Well, yes, they were living. They were the living examples of that. They had that experience of regional identity, and they had the experience of the war, of the Second World War. So it's
That's exactly, yes.
those two things together gave them the idea of what to do next, gave them the idea that we must have peace at all costs. We must do something that is going to secure, guarantee peace in Europe. And then the regional and this idea of building a political union in Europe, I think that very much came from their regional identities in terms of making the compromise. So they had the vision of creating peace, and then they had to also have, because not just an idea of let peace come, but let there be peace on earth. But you also have to have a plan. You have to have a strategy. So where did they get the idea of the strategy to create the European Union? And I think a lot of that does come from that idea of multiple identity. So they had the passion for peace, and they had from the heart, and they had the head and the experience of their regional, which helped them to create something that we still have today. And they created Europe One. Just before I pass to Europe Two, they created Europe One. And I think, Jabir, that Europe One is quite robust. I think that now it's 27 member states, and it's there are quite a few right-wing governments in Europe that like to attack and criticise the European Union, and I think we know who they are, or oppositions. We know about Le Pen in France. We know about Orban and others. But I think the right-wing leaders will attack the European Union because it's a good way of getting votes. But they're not going to come out of Europe One. They're not going to threaten to come out of Europe One, because in the end, whether you're a right-wing populist or a left-wing, unreconstructed communist, you don't want to have war in Europe. And you know that the European Union is a peace project, and it has delivered peace. Okay, people are going to say about Bosnia and what's going on in Ukraine now. We're going to talk about that. But fundamentally, it is great. How many wars have there been between France and Germany from the end of the Second World War to today? And how many wars were there in the 80 years prior to that? I rest my case. Okay. And people say, well, war is an old-fashioned thing. No, well, what is happening in Ukraine? What happened in Bosnia? Right. So European Union has done its job of protecting peace, and I think people buy into that and they understand that.
But the wars in Bosnia, the fall of Yugoslavia, and the brutal Russian aggression against Ukraine are not born from the ideas of peace. And they're not European Union or European events. They have been brought onto the people from power centers that are against peace. And that's as simple as it is.
I agree, but I just want to say that if you're listening to this and thinking to yourself, war is not a phenomenon that occurs in modern industrialized states, just have a look at what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. Just have a look at what happened in Yugoslavia. So we can't say that just because it's 2025 and not 1939, that we can assume that war is not going to happen. Because even in these modern times, on our doorstep, war happens, and maybe more war will happen soon.
Yes.
Come to that later. So you said, okay, so what happened next, right? You said, what happened next? You want me to I talked about the three unions. Europe of nations and states is Europe One, which we've been talking about so far. But then, yeah, but then and that was a piece. Then later, you mentioned the word prosperity. And obviously, there was a need to reconstruct livelihoods and businesses and the economy. And just as there will be in Ukraine after the conflict. And so there was the Marshall Plan, and there was the European Union, and it got to the point where people realized within the European Union that they needed to take things a step further than just the common agricultural policy and the economic steel community. They needed to create a free market in the European Union. Again, very, very ambitious plan. Yeah, and that would require free movement of people, capital, services, and goods. And strange enough, one of the people who was most in favour of this was a certain Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s. Later, she turned against the European Union, but initially she could see, because it was a very practical thing to do. Take away all of the barriers to trade that you can, and then you will have more trade within the European Union, and you will have that will help the economy, and you will have more prosperity. And alongside that, you needed to make sure that the gains from that were distributed fairly. So you needed to have mechanisms, the Regional Development Fund, the Social Fund, all kinds of other things that we know about. So there was this and a great idea of creating a single market. And then there was the idea, again, from this time coming from economists, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and from bankers, and driven by multinational companies who were rubbing their hands with glee at this. The idea of having a bigger market, more opportunities, and business needs to succeed so that we can all succeed. I'm not against business, but I'm just pointing out that what you had in the 1980s was a kind of political culture that was very open to the messages that were coming through from the business sector and from the banking sector, who were driving very hard for deregulation, for restructuring, for economic reforms in the area of trade liberalization and monetary liberalization as well. So there was a revolution in trade and monetary policy within the European Union in the 1980s, which had an incredible effect in terms of economic growth and prosperity and so on. And set against that, the kind of command economies in the east of Europe and from the old Soviet Union really had no answer. And gradually, people started slipping through coming through the eye. I was living in Munich at the time. I remember people coming out of East Germany through Hungary and turning up in our flat in Munich. And you had this sense of the levee about to break. And I was partly in Munich, partly in Berlin. I lived in between Berlin and Munich in the 1980s. And again, Berlin, to see this extraordinary way in which this peaceful movement in Eastern Germany, East Berlin, remember all the candlelit vigils and so on, and the great people like Václav Havel and so on, who were in the Czech Republic, how the citizens started to, in a peaceful way, started to mobilize. But that was coming from the East. What was coming from the West was the power of the economy. Yeah. And, Ronald Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear this wall down. But in fact, in the end, it was pushed down. It was pushed down by the people and the citizens. So that was really the moment when we should have seen Europe 3. And I'll come to that in a second. But the Europe 2 is a Europe of markets and money, right? And I think that is quite contested, Jabir, today. I think that is quite contested. I think that's what it is that, the Le Pens and others attack.
Yes, having your experience as a politician and also developing the trade between the UK and Italy during your post as a trade envoy of the United Kingdom. Why do you think, or why do you see figures such as Le Pen or AfD's leader, or Orban or Fico in Slovakia, or some other political figures nowadays as those that are actually opposing this developmental European dimension, the free market, the open market, and free trade and so on? How do you recognize their political stance as opposing to this?
Well, it's very. I'm from the left, so I'm not from the right, and I'm certainly not a populist, and I'm certainly not in favour of extremists. But what I want to say is that it's very understandable that they can't resist the temptation as right-wing populists. If I was a right-wing populist in the extremes, which I'm not, just to put your
Right.
viewers,
yes, we know that. We know
I
that.
would find it very difficult to resist the temptation to blame the areas of France where people have lost their jobs, high unemployment, and so on the European Union. To blame it on the European Union, to say this is the result of, they're not going to use those words, market liberalization, regulation, and so on, and the jobs have moved elsewhere, which is actually what happened. Yeah, that's what happened. Yeah,
That's right.
what's supposed to happen. Now, the European Union is not just a project of peace and a project for prosperity. It is also a project of solidarity. And we don't talk about that enough. We don't talk
solidarity and social justice. Yes.
Absolutely, solidarity and social justice. So the European Union should be doing, is doing a lot, and should be doing much more. And the reason it's not doing much more is not the fault of the European Union. It's because decisions are taken at the Council of Ministers level, and there may be blocking majorities and so on, and they haven't got the political. I'm sure the European Union would love to do more in these areas. Well, the Commission would, and probably the Parliament. Well, certainly the Commission, but it's very restricted in what it can do. But it does do things, and it is a project of solidarity. But it doesn't sell that. My criticism is that it doesn't sell that message very well. And so people in areas that feel that they have not benefited from this change, and remember, this liberalization in Europe is going on in the context of wider globalization. They feel very disaffected. And that is a very easy to exploit if you are a right-wing populist. And you blame it on the European Union, but what you're doing is you're attacking Europe too. You're not attacking Europe 1. You will never come out of Europe 1. You're attacking Europe too. But because we just don't think in terms of Europe 1, 2, and 3, we just think in terms of Europe. You just think they're attacking Europe, and you think that they're anti the whole thing. But my point is, they're not against Europe 1. They will never come out of Europe 1. They are exploiting people's disaffection about Europe 2, and they're attacking that. And they might come out of the single currency. They might come out of the single market. I mean, and again, if you think that that is something that no sensible person would do, just have a look at what's happening in the United States with, Trump tearing up the liberal trade rule book and going back towards sort of autarky and a national economy. I mean, I think I'm not saying that Le Pen would come in and take France out of the single currency. I don't think she would even do that, actually. But what I'm saying is that they will play with this idea that, what they stand for is the national state, and the problem people have, problem number one, is the European Union. They played that for a long time very successfully. And then when they couldn't squeeze any more juice out of that lemon, you know what they did? They started to attack the immigrants as well, and migration, we'll talk about that. So they're always wanting to point the finger at the other. And in Europe too, that's what you have. You have it contested. So in Europe 1, we're all friends. And in Europe 2, it's contested. It's politically contested because because there's an issue of social justice. But Europe 2, again, is the Europe of markets and money. The protagonists really were the bankers and the business leaders and also some academics and some politicians too. But primarily it was economic driven. There was a permissive political environment that opened up, did everything that was asked of it in terms of passing the legislation, creating the Single European Act and so on, and created Europe 2. And we still have Europe 2 today, but I don't think we can take that for granted in the future. Whereas I think Europe 1 is very robust. Now, if we don't have Europe 2, we're going to be in an even worse position in terms of people who've been disaffected and left behind, because we'll have less prosperity. So the last thing you want, if you want people to be more, if you want to have more social justice, is helpful to have a bit more prosperity rather than less. And then it's a question of how you actually invest that and how you actually, but you don't want to go to a situation where you have less prosperity. So I think we should be concerned in the middle of point, in the center of politics, about making sure that Europe too is we can't take it for granted. In 30 years' time, we might not have it. In 10 years' time, we might not have it. So that's what the question arises. How can we make Europe 2 more sustainable, more resilient? Yeah. And my answer to that is, well, you have to build Europe 3. So you might then ask, well, what is Europe 3? And my answer to that question is Europe 3 is not the Europe of nations and states, that's Europe 1, not the Europe of markets and money, that's Europe 2. Europe 3 is the Europe of cities and citizens, above all, citizens and cities. And what do I mean by
Europe?
Sorry?
Europe is is of citizens of Europe.
Yes,
cities and citizens of Europe.
Absolutely. And you can identify with that, whether you're a member, in my view, whether you're a member of the European Union or not. I mean, I know the European Union plays with this idea of European citizenship. If you've got a passport of a EU member state, then you call yourself a European citizen. But I want to say that a citizen, and that's true, and that's good. And I'd like to see even more rights that people have because they're a European passport holder. But I also want to say that you can identify yourself as a European, whether you have a European Union passport or not. Because the question of what is European for me, it's about values. It's about, do I subscribe to those values? And do I subscribe to the idea that we need to build our governments and our societies, whether we're in the European Union or not? Yeah. I'm not saying that, you have to immediately then join the European. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, okay, you could join the European Union and build a European Union consistent with those universal values as a European. Or if you're outside the European Union, you build your country, whether it's North Macedonia or Britain or wherever it is, true to those values. And maybe one day you'll be in the European Union. Maybe you won't. But in the meantime, you carry on building your European country. We're still Europeans. Don't give the European Union a monopoly on who is European, but give the European Union a fantastic amount of respect for what it has achieved, which is absolutely historic and inspiring. But it's not everybody's cup of tea, as we know from what happened in Britain. But the point is, that doesn't mean that you're not European anymore. It doesn't mean that you don't have those values. You've just decided that you're going to express those values in a different way. Now, Europe of citizens is really about democracy, making Europe safe. We talked about Europe for peace, Europe 1, Europe for prosperity, Europe 2. Now we're talking about Europe 3. What's Europe 3 about? Europe 3 is about making Europe a safe space for democracy and human rights. And who are the protagonists? Remember, the protagonists in Europe 1 were statesmen. In Europe 2, the bankers and the business people, the top brilliant. Who are the protagonists in Europe 3? Well, to me, we are the citizens.
Yes.
And this is our time. This is our time to show leadership. We look around today and we think, where are the leaders? But we live in different times. And look in the mirror. That's where you'll find a leader today. And I'm not talking about somebody becoming Martin Luther King or being on the television or something like that. I'm talking about, first of all, look around you and think, what is it that I can do as a citizen? And there's always something that you can do. I'm not saying be a good citizen, you have to do this. I'm not saying that from a moralistic point of view. I'm saying it from a very realistic, practical point of view. And I think we need to take more responsibility for what happens next. And we can make mistakes. We can vote for the wrong parties. So maybe next time we'll look at how this party's done and we'll vote for another one. But don't disengage from politics. Don't say, okay, they're all the same, when all the parties are not the same. So please, one thing you might think about doing is taking part in elections. If we have the next European elections and the turnout falls below 40%, and then it continues to fall, then I think the European project is in trouble. Because what it will mean is people not interested in the European Union. They don't think there's any legitimacy. And that will put a question mark over Europe too. So we want to see higher participation in elections. But democracy is not just about what happens in elections, important as that is. It's also about holding people to account between elections. And it's about participating. More and more local governments and regions in particular, and local councils are experimenting with participatory democracy. What do I mean by that? Opportunities for citizens to engage with decision makers between elections. And this has a great effect of bringing people together from different political points of view, putting their love for their local community above their political differences, and drawing on the experience of citizens to actually shape a better outcome for everybody locally. And I'd like to see higher participation in the Europe 3, the democratic participation, and I'd like to see more participatory democracy, much more citizens' assemblies, citizens' panels, more opportunities for citizens to participate between
protests, which are also important part of the democracy and democratic processes. But there are also many other ways that citizens between the election days can and should do in developing, defending, and preserving democracy and democratic values, and actually contribute to development of their own city or the neighborhood or the country as a whole. That means that there are, in the democratic countries, there are ways that they can make change or contribute towards different processes, improving the lives of people. And that's very important to understand, that it is not the Facebook or other social media that are creating the politics and the minds of people. People should go out of that vicious circle of lies and manipulation, PR, and so on, but to take part in those democratic processes and events. Go to the local municipal council, go to the parliament, make petitions, go to protests, of course, but also many other forms and formats of participating in democracy are available to people. And we need to explain that. We need to explain that to people. It's not only voting, and it's not only going to protest. There is a whole palette of different opportunities.
Absolutely, there is, and I'm just inviting our listeners to think when they engage in these things, to understand that this is part of their and expressing part of their European identity to do this, and it is part of the job of showing leadership in terms of making sure that Europe is a safe space for democracy and human rights, by standing up for those values, whether it's on a protest and whatever, or by participating. It's part of building Europe 3, and we need to build Europe 3. That's the most important job that we need to do now. It's going to make us safer, more secure, more resilient, and it's going to safeguard Europe 2, which is the bedrock of our prosperity. And it is going to give Europe a future, because, as I said right at the start of this conversation, Europe does not have a future unless it is a safe space for democracy and human rights. And building a Europe that's a safe space for human rights is the job of the citizens, not just the politicians.
Yes, and Roger, we need to, at least I need to stress the need for dialogue, the need for debate in the public discourse. What we are witnessing in the last several years, maybe a decade and maybe even longer, we see a number of monologues that are speaking to one channel only, to one audience only, in a competitive, extremely combative manner. And we don't see a dialogue, debate, in which ideas compete and prove each other. We're entrenched into a web of lies that are being broadcasted from different power centers. So what we need to do is to promote democratic debate, democratic dialogue, in which people listen to each other, start listening to each other. And even I would appeal that we need to start protecting the right of the other to express their opinion. Not only my right to express myself, but to protect the right of the others to express their opinion, to provide arguments, facts, experiences, concerns about certain topics at local, national, or international level. And that's very important. The debate, the democratic debate, has been suffocated in the last, I don't know how many years. And we need to reveal the opportunities. We need to build safe spaces for people to express themselves and to fight for democracy, fight for human rights, fight for their own livelihoods, to improve, to strive, and to protect democracy in Europe as such. You need to start at home, in the neighborhood, in the school, in the local NGO, or in the local media channel.
I love what you're saying, because you put your finger on the most important thing, in my view, in terms of how we're actually going to build Europe 3. And that is you use the word dialogue. And remember, when I was talking about Europe 1, I said that it was a peace project. We wanted a peace project. And the way that the key word for how we create the peace, how we do it, the answer to the how question was compromise. And remember, with Europe 2, I said we're looking for prosperity. We want to create prosperity. And the question how came, how do we do that? And the key word wasn't compromise. The key word was liberalize. And now I'm saying Europe 3, we want to have a Europe safe space for democracy and human rights. What is the key word? What is the equivalent of compromise for the peace project, for liberalize for the prosperity project? And I think you've told us the answer. And the word is dialogue. And as you said, with social media, everything tends to polarize. People have their own truth. And I think they do. I think people see the world in different ways. Difference is something that makes us what we are in Europe. Look at how many languages we speak. Look at the diversity in Europe. Look at the richness that through new communities, new people coming into Europe from outside. What a huge asset that is for Europe. Our diversity, our difference, because difference and diversity is part of nature, it's part of the natural world. Now, we can either fight wars or have arguments or polarize over difference, or we can try to communicate across difference without polarizing. And I think that does mean listening to people. Absolutely, it means listening to people and validating them in some way, which isn't the same thing as agreeing with them, because we're different, remember? I mean, so we're going to have different experiences. We're going to have different ways of looking at the world. We're going to come to different conclusions. One thing I hope we can, another thing you've mentioned, which I think is extremely important, is I hope we can agree on the facts. Yeah. But that's not the same thing as agreeing on the truth. Facts are facts, and truth is a very elusive thing. We all have our own truth, but the facts, I think, people mix up a lot of the time facts with opinions, and we need to agree. I hope agree on the facts, but we need to respect people's opinions. We need to respect that those opinions belong to them, and not try and make them think that necessarily the way that we think, if we think that that is the way to build Europe 3. Now, we're still going to have political conflicts and disagreements and so on, and that's fine, and arguments. I'm not saying, we suddenly all sit down and listen to each other and don't disagree with each other anymore. We will disagree, but we can disagree with each other a bit more respectfully. We can do it without having to negate or cancel or invalidate the other person. We can do, as you say, what you say, dialogue. You say, well, look, I'm really interested in what you think and why you think it. And I just want to understand why you think that. And it's not about, trying to get me to agree with you or trying to get you to agree with me. But I want to have a deeper understanding of why it is that you hold the view. And if you start doing that, you start to understand why people who believe fundamentally different things to you, but you come to understand why it is that they think that way, because they tell you something about themselves and their lives and how they've come to that point of view. and you can respect the fact that they're entitled to their point of view, and we can have a different dialogue, and they can listen to you, and you can explain your point of view. And I think what we find then is that we end up in a position where, first of all, we understand each other better, but secondly, out of that process comes something absolutely fantastic, which is an understanding that underneath all that we have some things in common. And sometimes we'll always have things that divide us, but we also have things because we're different. But we also have things that are in common. And if we polarize, we lose a perspective of what we have in common. And that common humanity and that common civility and that common underpinning of, for example, an affinity to democratic rights, which you've been talking about, that you talk about the democratic compass, that can emerge, that can come out, and that can strengthen. And that's going to benefit our communities and our society hugely if we can get to a point where, despite our political differences, there are certain core things that we actually understand unite us all. And listening and dialogue is the way to bring that about. I'm absolutely convinced about that. So thank you for mentioning the word dialogue.
Thank you. And it is the key, actually. And it's not the social media that are the place where people express themselves and start or lead a dialogue. Social media are business models to use people's minds to work for them and create profit out of it. It's based on algorithms. It's not a place where you, of course, there is this dimension, but mostly it's an illusion of freedom of speech. It's algorithms making profit for the owners, for the shareholders of those companies that are running these social media. It's not a place for freedom of expression. You know, it's a key thing to start talking to each other, to really start talking to each other, to understand, as you said, to understand why the other person or does not like this or another process or a law or a regulation or whatever. Why people are afraid of losing their identity, whilst there is no a single threat to their identity, you know, or why people fear their jobs will be taken by migrants, whilst it's a completely different reason why they may lose their position in the company they work for. They need to look for the reasons, but in order to do so, they need to learn about each other. They need to respect other people's arguments and facts, and actually, abandon this devastating state of mind in which people reading fake news believe those fake news because actually they're biased. You know, when they read the news, the fake news, and they say, yeah, this is true because they were biased before, that confirmed their bias, their prejudice, or their stereotype. It's not that they got convinced by the fake news producer. It's that they already had some fear or some idea about this, and it only confirms their bias. And that's why the fake news is so and disinformation are so successful, because they're searching, hunting for the fears of the people or for the bias of the people, and they're just confirming it. Putting a concrete a foundation of their own fears or their ideas of how the world needs to look like. So that's very important, absolutely important. And it is somewhere where I keep on showing this book that is also behind us. What we were talking about is also composed in the first couple of chapters of the policy document there, about the need of people and of the civil society, of the media, of the academia, and of course of of progressive, democratic, and moderate politicians to promote the values, to promote the benefits of Europe 1, 2, and especially of Europe 3, as you envision it. That's also to promote those values, to defend them, because values are not given from vis maior, or we are not able to buy them in a supermarket. We need to build them and to defend them and to live through them. That's very important. And it's not anything that is imaginary. It's there. We have it. But we only need to develop it and defend it. And
you've said it very, very well, and you yourself are very engaged with the process of identifying and countering fake news and disinformation. And yes, you've expressed it. You've expressed it very well. The way in which social media amplifies all of this and reinforces stereotypes. I just want to say, perhaps there's sort of some final remarks on this. I mean, I don't want to have a council of despair about social media. I mean, yes, you're right. It's all in the algorithms. It's all in the business models of the platforms. It's really to understand what's going on there. You need to understand that these are businesses looking to make a profit like any other business. And so I think there can be a panic sometimes. We can get over anxious about this, and we can think that we need to start interfering with these. And we do need to regulate it. Like every part of the economy, it needs greater or less regulation in one way or the other. We do need to be careful about that. For example, protecting minors and also avoiding hate crimes and so on. And there are limits. There are limits to that. But I don't think we should be, think to ourselves that if we could somehow create a situation where we could filter out all the fake news that comes through social media, that would somehow solve the problem. We can't do that anyway, and even if we could, I don't think it would solve the problem, because there's still going to be business people out there trying to make money, and there's still going to be, this is an extreme form of don't believe what you read in the papers, but it's the same kind of thing, and people know. That's the second point, is that I want to trust the citizens. In Europe 3, I want informed, critical, aware citizens, and I want to trust the citizens. Yes. I want to put my faith in the citizens and in their ability. And I think it's not about controlling social media. It's about understanding that, the problem we got there. But, that is the way that the world is, and people like to consume these things. And, people don't believe everything they read in the paper, and they don't believe everything that they read on social media, although obviously a lot of people do. Perhaps more people believe what they see on social media than they do in the papers. I don't know. The thing is, that's just part of life, and that's part of our reality, and it will always be thus. What I'm saying is not try to kind of, grapple with that and stop people watching. I know you're not saying that. What I'm saying is just let that be. I mean, with obviously a degree of regulation which is required by law and which we constantly need to review and update. But alongside of that, create other opportunities for citizens to engage, citizens panels, citizens assemblies, and put the argument out there that actually, although it's sometimes fun to slag people off on social media, if that's what you do, not everybody does that. Some people use it to share photos of their families. But we know that is going on. You need to look at the toxicity of X and things like that. We know that's happening. What we're saying is, why don't we try this as well? Why don't we? And that's about opening up the space and holding the space where this kind of dialogue and this kind of process that you're talking about can occur. So I would like to be much more interested in that.
Of course, I'm not calling for a crusade against social media, and fake news, disinformation, propaganda is also in the media as well. In some countries, even in the public media, in the state-owned media, and in the news agencies, and everywhere. So I'm not particularly pointing my finger to the social media, not at all. But it is one of the examples, the most prominent example in which people get manipulated, not because of the fake news itself. It's also because the fake news are confirming the bias of the people, because they're still closed within their own fears and concerns. So what we need to do is to open their minds, to call them to open their minds and start talking to each other. Maybe at some point they will also talk to each other in a little bit higher, at a little bit higher tone, or maybe with some sharper language. But still, that's a very good start. And
I don't want to be prescriptive. I don't want to say to people they need to behave in a certain way. In Europe 3, I would like to think that we trust the citizens more. We trust that we empower citizens. We're not afraid of the power of citizens. What do I mean by that? Give them more decision-making power, give them more opportunity to not just express their opinion, but also to decide things. You mentioned, protests, referendums, and things. Now, I'm not saying that you give the power to people who shout the loudest. What I'm saying is we need to have, and we're seeing this now at local level and regional level, you need to go about it in a very systematic way. Maybe you can select citizens by lot, by lottery and so on. You create panel, but you say, look, we as a local council or we as a regional government, we're going to try and decide this issue in this way. And through consultation, and you bring people together from different age groups, different ethnicities, different points of view, different areas, different social groups, and you try to look at a particularly difficult issue. This has worked, for example, extremely well with the abortion issue in Ireland, which was a highly contentious, highly divisive issue. Yes. And managed to bring about some reforms by actually trusting in the citizens, bringing citizens together, but not to have kind of one protest against the other, one march against the other, see which one is stronger, but actually bring people together from the two sides of the argument to actually understand each other better, what each other's concerns were, and find a way forward, which they've actually now been able to do. So I think that, and it's about not negating other people just because they've got a different point of view to you, but actually creating the spaces where people can listen to each other and find their common humanity, understand where they're coming from, and move forwards together. And so I'd like to see more opportunities created for that. And I'm seeing that. I'm seeing that in various places in Europe, at local level, in government level. And we need to see it at the national level. And so, as I mentioned, Ireland, that was a national initiative. That was a very good one. And we've seen it at the European level with the Conference on the Future of Europe. And I hope that the Conference of Europe, the Future of Europe, will not be forgotten. In fact, I hope it will lead to a permanent mechanism for citizens' engagement, citizen involvement, because I think that is the way to underpin the European Union and to give Europe a future, which it will not have unless we can create Europe as a safe space for democracy and human rights. And that is the job of the citizens and not just the politicians.
I'll tell this to the audience that I'll make sure that I will give my best to convince you to write a book about Europe 3. However, I would even go further. I mean, citizens already have the power. They already have the power. They already have the democratic, in democratic countries, of course, not in a lot of people, not in Belarus, for instance. In democratic countries, they already have the power. They just need to rediscover it and to use it.
Yeah.
It takes a little bit of efforts, of course. No, it's not just like, I have a power. I do. No. And, it's important that they practice that power, that the power that they have as citizens can be channeled into different directions, topics, issues. Again, not to be boring, but I insist on constantly reminding people that dialogue and debate is very important to practice their power, and that brings about results. Of course, in this Europe, we have a system of democratic values. We have the rule of law. We have the the fundamental human rights respect by the institutions and so on. The system is promoting this. And somewhere in all the political processes and in the realities, some of that gets forgotten, some of that is violated, some of that is severely violated, and so on. And in this Europe, I see that there are several political blocs. And what I tried to do recently, I wrote an article, and I think there will be a few more about the political compass. So we need to start with the democratic values. What are they? It's not the political party values, or it's not the programs and so on. We need to understand what the democratic values are, the ones that are universal, the ones that you spoke of in the beginning of this conversation, and then put the main political blocks one next to another and see where they succeed and where they fail to follow, to defend, or to practice those democratic values. Whether it's social democrats, or the Greens, or the center-right conservatives, so on. And of course, we need to understand that the far right and the fringe party, the extremist populist gangs, I would call them, they don't fall into the system of democratic value. And we need to understand that they will be successful every next election as long as the citizens are not understanding their power, that normalizing far right ideologies is dangerous for their lives and for their countries and for their values and for Europe as such. And that's very important to understand. And that's why, I mean, we can't avoid not mentioning Ukraine here. That's why we see the Russian aggression as an aggression not only against the territory of Ukraine, it's against the values, against the rights of existence, and it's against the democratic values of Europe and of the democratic part of the world. That's why this fight is not only on the shoulders of the Ukrainian soldiers. It's on our soldiers. It's on our shoulders as well. Because if Ukraine falls, we fall as well. Because the democratic values will fall. I'm sorry, I'm giving a too long explanation of the necessity to understand and to defend democratic values, and also to see realistically how political blocs in Europe, including my country here, are actually fading away or going away from those values, or in some cases, in many cases, they're actually practicing those values in their programs and policymaking. I don't know if you have a comment on it, but of course, we need to understand that political blocs or political parties are also citizens, composed of citizens. It's not small, narrow power groups that only defend their own interests. In that case, well, we see that happening as well, but in that case, it's not what a political party should represent.
Well, you mentioned in your article, Democratic Compass, you rightly make the distinction between left and right, and democracy and authoritarianism. And parties from different political blocs, whether they're Greens or centre-left or centre-right or whatever they are, or even more to the right, can still subscribe to the democratic compass rather than be on the authoritarian side. And I think we as citizens need to hold them to account. So you might feel tempted to move more to the right, but then there may come a point where it becomes so authoritarian, or that may happen to the left as well, where you part company. And what we see, for example, in the United States at the moment, funnily enough, over this Epstein thing, is that there are cracks appearing in the constituency of Donald Trump over this issue, because if it turns out that he's implicated in the Epstein files, that would be a bridge too far for some of the people in his constituency, and they won't like it, and they will part company with him. And I was wondering what it was he needed to do. I mean, given all the way in which he's treated the American Constitution, the migrants, and this revolutionary way in which he's behaving in an absolutely kleptocratic way, taking it. I mean, and authoritarian way. I was wondering when will the point come where people think, well, I like Donald Trump and I'm on the right of politics, but I don't like this, and this isn't right. And it looks like it might come with the Epstein thing, which is really interesting. But it's not coming because of his sort of behavior with Epstein. I mean, we don't know anything about that, so we're waiting to see. But it could well be that would be the point where there's a sort of a rift. Now, translating that to Europe, what you're talking about with the democratic compass, is there a point where, I'm not talking about sexual scandals and things like that, but I'm talking about where leaders become so authoritarian that there's a rift where in their own constituency, where people say, no, you've crossed the line. So I'm with you up to this point, but where you actually stop subscribing to and behaving in a way that fits the democratic compass, then I'm out of there and it breaks down. And that's not much a left-right issue. It's an issue to do with democracy versus autocracy. And I think you're right about that. I think there are two things going on. People want to shift between left and right for all kinds of reasons. But then underneath it, fundamentally, we're Europeans, we're Democrats. If somebody moves too far away from the democratic compass, even if we're sympathetic to their right-wing politics, we're going to part company. Are we going to see that? Are we going to see that? Are we going to see that happening? And you talked about, I think Ukraine is a good test. I think Ukraine is a good test in a way, the other way around. Because you're right to say that Ukraine is not just involved in a battle to make Ukraine safe for democracy and human rights, and let's hope that Ukraine in the future can be democracy and human rights. And of course, there's that story again. We've seen protests about laws that Zelensky passed to do with
that's fine. That's great.
Internal, and that's a very good process. That shows that's coming out, and he retracted, but. So, Ukraine's still got a long way to go to really demonstrate a free Ukraine can be a safe space for democracy and human rights. Still got some way to go with that. But that's the path that it's on. But we're not just talking about Ukraine in the future as a safe space for democracy and human rights. We're talking about the very existence of Ukraine as an independent nation. And I think that, again, we've got the kind of, you might call it democratic compass, you might call it the moral compass here. Do we stand up for a country that is threatened with annihilation, that being wiped off the face of the earth by another one, or not, that is actually identifying with the European values? And I think we don't have a choice if we are talking about European values, Europe 1, 2, and 3, the values, peace, prosperity, democracy and security and human rights. If we care about those things, solidarity, the rule of law, freedom, equality, then we have to care about the future of Ukraine. And I would go further and say we have to see, I believe that what I see, and I don't know about your listeners, is that not only do we care about Ukraine, the future of Ukraine, and Ukraine must not fall, but the future of Ukraine is very much the future of Europe. Because I don't see how we can have Europe as a safe space for democracy and human rights. I don't see how we can have Europe 3 unless we have a free and, I hope, democratic and Ukraine that is itself a safe space in the future for democracy and human rights. And that has to emerge from Ukraine. I think it's emerging from the people of Ukraine, from their courage, from their resilience, from their strength, which is standing up for not just for their own lives and their livelihoods, but also for a vision of a new Ukraine, which will be a Ukraine which is a safe space for democracy and human rights. And if we don't get that for Ukraine, we won't make that happen for Europe. So I think the future of Ukraine is the future of Europe, and the future of Ukraine and Europe is to make our societies a safe space for democracy and human rights. And we have to work with Ukraine, support Ukraine. That's the front line. But we also have to do that work in the rest of Europe for Europe 3 to emerge. And so I think you can't separate the two things, the future of Ukraine from the future of Europe. Once again, call on all your viewers to do what we can to support Ukraine and to engage in our own societies and communities to keep building Europe 3, a Europe that is a safe space, Europe of the citizens, Europe that is a safe space for democracy and human rights, where life can return to normal and people can live side by side in peace.
That's wonderfully put, Roger, as always. It is important to understand that this is the core interest of Europe, of every single European citizen. In fact, it is the promise of the future. If we see the victory of freedom, rule of law, democracy, and peace over aggression, genocidal politics, and authoritarianism, dictatorship, and so, because these two groups are actually struggling, fighting in Ukraine and in Europe now, because the Kremlin is not waging war against Ukraine only, it's also waging war against democracy itself. So that's why we need to understand this and get engaged and defend our values, defend our democracy. Then back to what you just said about the Epstein files and the Epstein scandal, I would say, which is now shaking the United States, even made President Trump flying over 3,000 miles to Scotland to escape the scandalous the development of the story, of course, unsuccessfully, because there is internet in Scotland as well. Does it? So when we come to this, while you were describing this, the importance of the Epstein files and the Epstein scandal, one word came to my mind. It's accountability. People, regardless whether they're MAGA, Republicans, conservatives, socialists, Democrats, independent, undefined, or whatever, they are now looking into the White House and waiting or demanding accountability. So that would be my final thought now for today, if you agree, is that we need to encourage people to demand accountability from their governments, accountability from political leaders who sometimes talk rubbish from the political stage and disrupt people's minds and lives with hate and lies. They need to demand accountability for the actions and the words of the government and of the politicians, and of course of the companies and other stakeholders that come in the public discourse every day and every night, whether it's social media, or in the public stage. People need to demand accountability, and that's one more crucial message that I think we should conclude with today.
And on yes, I couldn't agree more. And I think people are doing that. I think there are signs that people are doing that. They are standing up for our rights, and they are demanding accountability. And that is absolutely crucial, absolutely key, and have more, as you rightly say, have more power sometimes as citizens than we realize, because we can hold our politicians to account. We are holding our politicians to account, and that is a very important act of citizenship. So, hold politicians to account, but be open, listen to people who have different points of view, listen to people in your community, listen and engage and participate when the opportunity arises. Because the future is a place that we're going to together, and your no voice is too small, and no opinion is really something that we want to leave out of account. So that kind of it works both ways. Hold those who take decisions to account, but make sure that your point of view is taken account of, and make sure that you take account of your neighbour's point of view as well. So it's a different sense of accountability, but we're going to the future together, and it's a future that all of us have a stake in, all of us belong in, a future that is a place where everybody can feel that they belong, where everybody has a voice, where everybody is can feel that they've been listened to. But if we want to be listened to, a great way to start is by listening to others. So we want to move in direction of more dialogue, more listening, more respect, more inclusion. But in the meantime, those who are taking decisions on our behalf need our attention and need us to stand up and hold them to account. And I can see that people are doing that, and I hope we'll see more of that in the future.
So that's possible, being a politician and having all these positions, all these stands. Yeah. Being a former member of the UK Parliament, you believe that a politician should be like this, what you just described now?
Yes, a politician should be held to account.
That's fantastic.
Absolutely. A politician has the trust of people and is taking decisions on behalf of people and needs to be held to account for the decisions that he or she takes. And we also need to trust the citizens.
Yes. Yes.
And we need to listen to each other more, and we need to have more dialogue. Yeah, more dialogue and more accountability as well.
I hope that the politicians who want to, or the young people who want to enter politics, will listen to this episode of Eyes on Democracy and will take your example. And of course, until the next time, I thank you very much for this wonderful conversation, indeed.
Thank you very much, Jabir, and to your dear listeners at home.
Thank you. Until the next time, bye.